put my contact info in the chat in a little bit. I'm very accessible. I always offer to the Uninc folks, like, if you want to talk, get on Zoom and just talk about what you're working on. I'm very accessible, and I believe very deeply in what Ben is doing with the Uninc, and so reach out. So I have a very unorthodox background, but there's a thread that runs through it of a sensitivity to injustice, which is maybe an interesting thing for a person that has a 78% chance of being a Trump supporter based off of data. So I grew up in rural America. I don't have a college degree, straight white, Christian-ish, male, all those things. But my whole life, and I think partially it's because I am what's called a HSP, a highly sensitive person, which is kind of like an emotional super taster, and also neurodivergent with ADHD, and also a childhood trauma survivor, years of violence at home and at school. And those things just made me acutely aware of unfairness in the world. And so I remember as a kid, I'm a history nerd, reading about this about slavery, or about the Holocaust, or about indigenous people, and realizing that what I was being taught in history didn't match what I was being taught in class, didn't match the actual history, and that there had to be a reason for that. I learned later that it was white supremacy and patriarchy and things like that. So I've been a branding guy for the last 20 years. And again, there's many more elements and layers to this story. I'll be 53 next month, so the story gets more complicated and longer. But a few years ago, I don't know if any of you have gone through kind of like a consciousness path where you have this like slow dawning. And so in hindsight, I could see this thread of injustice all the way through my life, the sensitivity to injustice, but really became something I began to organize my life around clumsily in a way after there were three pivotal events. Number one was George Floyd's murder. And it's not the first time that happened, but there was something about it that shifted something in me where I'm like, I can't just, like, I loathe passive activism, because it's an oxymoron. And I also realized that for years, my mission has been, even if I never stated it this way, to make white people uncomfortable. And I realized I just need to do that. I need to make white people uncomfortable, especially white men, uncomfortable. So that's what I do. I mean, on my writings and my poetry and things like that. The second thing is I met my now soon-to-be wife, but partner, Virginia, who is an immigrant, a Latina, an activist. And she really opened my eyes to how different even like feminism is in other countries. She pointed out that in the United States, women are fighting for equal rights related to, reproductive rights or wage equality, things like that. In Latin America, where she's from, in Nicaragua in particular, they're fighting for the right to live. Central America has the highest femicide rate in the world. So that was eye-opening. And then January 6th, I was like, this is fucked up. Like, you to combine these things. And then so I was like, I want to do branding work for people that are actually trying to create systemic change basically for non-political reasons. It's not ideology, it's a calling. It's a level of consciousness. So I started studying spiral dynamics. And spiral dynamics is basically evolutionary theory, quantum theory applied to consciousness. And where you go from like me, we to everyone. And we decided to build a company around people that are in that we to everyone phase, where they have status, they have power, they have a brand, they've got resources, but they've been doing the work and they've been waking up, and now they want to do something about it. And again, that thread all the way through since I was a little kid of sensitivity to injustice, which with the elevation of consciousness, you cannot raise your consciousness and also keep your ignorance or privilege about systemic injustice. It's impossible. And so what I'm seeing is this, like, sometimes almost like a collision of my calling and my talents and the time in history that we're in. And for the first time really in my life, I feel very integrated of the work I'm doing. I don't feel like it's separate and there's brand guy, spiritual guy, whatever. It's just me. So that's my story.
Thank you, Justin. It's an incredible story. Thank you for sharing. And can you share with us a few experiences working with CEOs in Massive Impact and how they've worked with you with their brand and
right.
Systemic change?
Yeah. So we work with the founder or the CEO, the small business owner, and we work with kind of two people. We give them archetypes. The first one are history shapers. These are people that really have juice. They have power, they have authority, and they are trying to fuck shit up, like really change things. And then we work with what we call system shakers. And those are people that maybe are smaller business, micro business owners, or they are like middle management in a big company, and they're trying to make change from the inside. And we have different programs for each of those types, but they basically follow three phases. The first one is around their personal brand, building the brand of who they are around their mission or calling, and making a public stance about the thing that they're here to do, because I believe your mission is your brand. It's the same thing. And then that's more my work. And then Virginia works with them on mindset that it takes to take on the system. So she works on emotional resiliency and managing your ego and making sure that you can manage and regulate your emotions, because the system will, by its nature, when you begin to challenge it and poke at it, it will try to gaslight you. It will try to tell you you're crazy. Especially people in the industry that you're trying to change or in the society you're trying to change. And then we work on kind of the movement itself of how to build a grassroots movement around systemic change using your business and your brand or your role in leadership as kind of the rocket fuel and the platform to create this change. In the business world, it's typically the kings feed the priests. You build a good business and you start a foundation, and that's fine, but that doesn't change the system. We're grateful for like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or Jeff Bezos's ex-wife, or Warren Buffett. All these rich people that have foundations, and they're good at like funding organizations that are working within the problem or on the problem, but they do not change the system. It takes force to change the system because it's complexity science. It takes a shock. And the only people that can shock the system right now are business people, really. I mean, when you look at actual policy change, and my favorite example of this recently is we went to the Pride Parade in Austin earlier, a couple months ago or last month, whenever that was. And hundreds, dozens and dozens of corporate sponsors of very old and kind of traditionally stodgy companies like, Accenture and Samsung and T-Mobile. And like, I thought, well, where does that come from? Well, in modern society, social pressure and market pressure are the same thing. So the market pressure puts pressure on companies to evolve. And because they have pull, they got juice, they create the policy change. And therefore, from that, for example, the Respect for Marriage Act was passed. And that came from social pressure to evolve. And you're seeing this with things like DEI programs and corporate social good. And so, but those are all those are pressures on the system, but it takes actual real leadership to implement, to create like policy change or winning the hearts and minds of society, as it were.
Thank you, Justin. That's a great description of your work and how the process people go through in working with you. And how do you think about the overlap in consciousness, personal branding, and activist leadership? Maybe you already had touched base there, but I don't know if you had any other notes.
Yeah. I think it goes to three kinds of consciousness. There's kind of like intellectual or mental consciousness. This is where you're aware that you are not your thoughts and feelings. You're aware that, especially if you're a trauma survivor, and that you created kind of a hologram that is who you put out to society, but it's not really you. And that's kind of like traditional like intellectual mental consciousness. Like Sam Harris, the neuroscientist, is kind of my favorite expert in that field. And that mental consciousness or intellectual consciousness helps you understand that your thoughts and feelings, your thoughts are really not your own. Most of them originate from social conditioning. And so there's an element of sort of like self-identity of like, do I actually believe this? Where did this thought come from? Spiritual consciousness is the kind of the traditional enlightenment or awakening, like Buddha had, or Jesus talked about, or other mystics and spiritual masters over the years. And that's a very different thing, but it always includes a calling. So you can have an intellectual awakening and may not have a calling. You're just more aware that you are not who you thought you were. But a spiritual awakening, you have a direct calling that no one is awakened to just keep things the same. And so that plays into activist leadership too. And it's usually, and this is where like Virginia works with leaders that have had a spiritual awakening in particular because of imposter syndrome or insecurity. It's like, why am I being called to do this? I don't know how to lead people this way. Well, it's always that way. Everyone, if you get a calling and you're like, yeah, I'm going to crush this, then it might be your ego talking. And then there's social consciousness. And I kind of followed the sequence of spiritual, then mental, then social. And so social consciousness is where you realize how you are, you have, like for me as a white man, I have been benefiting from a system, unaware that I'm benefiting from that system, thinking it's a meritocracy. And not that there aren't meritocracies, but it's most of it's mythology, American mythology, that there are meritocracies. So that's social consciousness. And it's seeing the connectedness of things, like how crime, it can be associated with socioeconomic issues far more than some character flaw, as an example. Or we have a punitive drug policy here that punishes drug addicts as opposed to, helps them get, it's seen as a healthcare crisis. We treat it as a crime. And there are many other examples of social consciousness. And it's interesting because you can have a spiritual awakening and you may have a calling, but the social consciousness aspect of it is the actual way you're going to go do it. I use biblical examples, but like Moses and his calling, he had an awakening, a burning bush, you're going to get my people out of Egypt. And that was both a spiritual calling and a social calling because of the, the story of the injustice that the Israelites were facing in Egypt as a historical example. So,
thank you.
And I would also say this, Ben, it's like you look at real history shapers, like the big ones, and we all know Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Desmond Tutu, Harvey Milk, going down the road. Pick your history shaper. They have some commonalities. They have a calling. They have a great brand. Jesus was a great brander. So was Buddha. So was Muhammad. They were great at branding. And they understood that being the best kept secret means you just suck at marketing, and that if no one knows what you're doing, that's usually because you're afraid, not because you don't work on your brand, you don't put yourself out there. They have what Virginia calls an indomabile mindset, which is basically a mind that's unable to be tamed by society. So truly independent thinkers, to the point that in many cases these history shapers are killed by the systems they're trying to change. And they have resources to do something about it. And so that's the linkage between all of those things. That's for that, I think we can all be history shapers in some form or another, but I'm using famous ones to kind of highlight who we're working with, the kind of character of the people we're working with.
Yeah, thank you, Justin. And I love the framing around the different ways to think about consciousness inside of your work as a social entrepreneur. And maybe we can touch base a little bit on language in our work as entrepreneurs. How do you navigate the intricacies of conveying our brand through words?
Yeah, and this is more of a shift away from like maybe what Massive does and more what just my background is I refer to what I do as brand poetry. And and you got to get three things, well, maybe you got to get four things right, but let's call them three. You got to have good visuals. You can't suck. You can't suck. It can't look like, a shit sandwich visually. You have to have a good product and a good customer experience. Again, that's not optional. If you've shopped retail recently, you would think it's optional because there's retail's a degrading enterprise or a degrading industry. But mostly what drives decision, what drives your brand is language, because language is the bridge between the left and the right brain. And one of the things that there's humility is a great character trait, but a shitty brand strategy is that this is why when I'm doing brand language work with people, I use what I call the 2 shots of tequila rule. Like, what would you say after 2 shots of tequila, or 3 or 4 or whatever it takes to tell the truth, to be unfiltered? And what are you saying from your heart? What are you inviting people to? What are you saying that's original? What are you saying that will make people think? That all comes from language. And what I believe from a spiritual perspective is your soul knows what to say, and it's your head that gets in the way. Because our head wants to explain, especially us dudes. We want to explain everything. Or it gets in the way with arrogance, which is my product's so amazing that I don't need to do good branding visually or language. Or more predominant is a type of insecurity or inadequacy, which is I don't really have true confidence in this, and I hope it works out, and maybe they'll figure it out. And so that's why I call what I do brand poetry, because the job of a poet is to translate something mystical so that it's understood in the material world, which is the same exact thing that your brand language is supposed to do.
Thank you, Justin. That's great on language. And this last question, before we jump into journaling, is on this topic of what makes us unique as founders. I know you talk a lot about neurodiversity in your work. What perspective can you give us around embracing what makes us unique or diverse in our work as social entrepreneurs?
Yeah, so I think number one is your calling makes you unique. Your calling or your mission makes you unique, whatever that is. No one, I mean, two people, 2,000 people may have a similar calling, but nobody has your specific calling in the way that you've been called to do it. The second are your values. They make you different, and people are far more interested in your values than your value. That if there's values alignment, you can charge a profitable amount of money. You don't have to discount yourself if you know what your values are and you organize your brand around your values. And then you have your wiring. And I'm not saying that, there are neurotypical people and neurodivergent people, and the wiring of someone that's neurotypical, maybe it's not because they're neurotypical, maybe their wiring is related to their different orientation. Maybe it's the gender orientation or sexual orientation or something, that just your wiring is unique. Only you have that wiring. But neurodivergent people, we have an issue with branding, because underneath all neurodivergence, the prevailing negative emotion is shame. And so one of the things when I coach neurodivergent people on their brand is you almost have to ignore the part of yourself that doesn't want to tell the truth, because we're all experts at masking. And I tell people, fuck that. Take the mask off. Like, show people who you really are and let them react to you. But that's hard for neurodivergent people to do, because we all feel kind of weird and miscast and misfit, and we're highly adaptable. But what I'm saying is, what makes you different, man, that is your brand. That is your brand. And that's the more unique you are in your wiring and your values, your story, your calling, the easier it is to brand yourself. The more you are what I call a potted plant. This is what I call a lot of white girls on Instagram. You could replace them and someone else in their feed and no one would ever notice, because they look exactly the same. or dudes in corporate dudes in, you know, polo shirts and khaki pants. Those dudes are very replaceable. And that's partially because they just haven't embraced who they really fully are. And some of it is just, it's a sea of sameness. And so differentiation by being who you really are will always make you different. And that's the whole point of branding, is to be different. Sameness is the enemy here.
Thank you. Any other thoughts or anything you'd like to share with us before we jump into some journal time and come back?
Yeah, just a couple of things that come to mind too for social entrepreneurs and people that are organizing their life around, you know, a creative calling in particular, is there's this kind of humility that needs to be had, that basically it's to embrace insecurity. Embrace it as part of it. It means you're doing something risky. And if you start to get overly confident in what you're doing, that's a little bit dangerous. And I know a lot of entrepreneurs, creative entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurs, which are like, how do I get rid of the fear? I'm like, well, you really don't. It's like being a parent, you know, like you never really stop worrying about your kids, no matter how. My oldest son is 30 and I still worry about him. It's about what you do with it, what you do with your fear. The second thing is if you haven't done inner work related to especially trauma, would be that generational trauma, which is common with every person of color I know, every woman I know, every LGBTQ person I know has to deal with generational trauma. But it could be direct trauma from a violent childhood or being a combat vet or something like that. That trauma, when it's unintegrated, is governing you and you don't even know it. It's affecting the way you think about yourself. It's affecting the way you show up in the world. And so, you know, I understand that people don't necessarily have the economic security to go to a therapist, but there are other ways. There are plenty of free resources to begin to do trauma integration, and it will transform your confidence, and it will allow you to have two things. It will allow you to have confidence in your calling and your skills, and it will allow you to surf or flow with fear rather than be terrified of it, rather than letting it govern you. And a lot of that comes from just dealing with with unresolved, or what I call unintegrated trauma.